Perelman, it's a pleasure to speak to you today. I really
It's my
appreciate
pleasure.
taking the time.
Thank you.
I think you probably know that you have a legendary status among Delaware corporate lawyers and lawyers who study Delaware corporate law. So this is a rare opportunity to get a little bit of better sense of your role in these cases and what these cases were about. So thanks. And in that regard, what aspects of your personal background do you think would be most meaningful to people who are studying these cases?
I think I am the world's most tenacious human being on the planet, and probably the most impatient, and like to get things done quickly and smartly, and very rarely reach the point of giving up. My first wife once said to me, you kick a dead horse and tell it to get its ass up moving. And I think that one comment described me more accurately than anything else that I've ever heard about me.
Okay, so let's talk about how that character gets applied. As I understand it, your business vehicle, at least for a long time, has been McAndrews & Forbes.
Correct.
What's the history of that company?
McAndrews & Forbes came about through an acquisition by the first deal I ever bought called Cone Hatfield Industries, which was a retail, wholesale, and lease department jewelry operator. And it was significant in several ways. First of all, it gave me a very easily and quickly liquidatable vehicle to do the deal I wanted to do in. And to do so with the support, I was only buying 45% of that company, but to do so with the upfront support of the other shareholders and management. It was an American Stock Exchange listed company. Secondly, we operated the lease department stores in Walmart. So the day after this deal was announced in the Wall Street Journal, I got a call from Sam Walton. And he said, Mr. Perelman, this is Mr. Sam. I'd like to talk to you about your new vehicle here that you just bought. I said, when's a good time? He said, how about tomorrow morning? I flew out to Bentonville, and from that first meeting, we developed a fabulous, fabulous relationship. And several years later, he said to me, I know that you don't want to be in this business. Probably 2 years later. Forever. When you're ready to get out, just call me. We'll take an inventory over the weekend, and I'll send you a check on Monday. And we did do that, and that's how it happened. And when we got to Revlon, Sam was still having problems getting major brands to enter the discount area in his stores. And the deal was that all the department stores where your brands would sit would throw you out if you went to Walmart's. And he called me up one day and he said, I really need a cosmetics brand. Would you consider selling to us? And I said, you know what that means? He said, absolutely. And I said, yes, we'll do it. And today they're our single largest customer. They're half of our business. And more importantly, I think once you have sort of proven yourself as a founding partner of Walmart and selling your brands to them, they treat you differently. And they're an amazing partner to begin with. But if you were early on with them, they treat you as almost family. And it's been a fabulous, fabulous relationship for each of our companies to have with Walmart. So we used Cone Hatfield to buy McAndrews & Forbes, which was then primarily a licorice supplier to the tobacco industry and a manufacturer of chocolate to the secondary market, to the manufacturers. So we would sell chocolate too. Entenmann's bakery, and we would sell chocolate to ice cream makers and the like. We had a very, very small retail business. And we ultimately sold that, and we were left just with the licorice business. And I changed the name from Cone Hatfield to McAndrews and Forbes, and that's been the name ever since.
Okay. And so was that interaction with Sam Walton the impetus for the original idea of acquiring Revlon? Was
No.
Okay, so
No,
where did that come from?
That came later. I had heard that Bergerac was thinking about taking it private. And it was sort of, around, they used to have what they called the gin rummy crowd. And it was Bergerac, it was Martin Revson, it was Ed Down, it was 2 or 3 other people. And all those people talked a lot. And they talked about Bergerac talking about taking it private. And I looked at it, and it was our perfect kind of transaction. It had many pieces. Many of the pieces I thought were much more valuable than the market was giving them credit for. And I liked the beauty business, which nobody else liked. And it became, very, very quickly obvious to me that this was a transaction that was just perfect for us. And, then we started the process.
Right. How important was the aspect of Pantry Pride with its net operating loss carryforwards? Was that part of the thinking too?
Well, we bought Pantry Pride because of its NOL. It was in 3 terrible businesses: the retail food business, the retail drugstore business, and the subpar finance business, basically, of electronic parts and components. And but I thought that we could get out of those 3 businesses pretty quickly, and then we'd be left with a vehicle with cash and a large NOL. And the NOL I thought was a valuable asset for this or any other transaction. When we sort of defined Revlon as a target, they just fit together really, really nicely, both in timing wise and in what we expected to do as a vehicle.
Okay. So you mentioned Michel Bergerac.
Right.
Of course,
Right.
there are these veiled references in the court opinions to strong personal antipathy and your meetings with him, but let's hear it from the horse's mouth. What was it like meeting with him?
Well,
What
my
happened?
first meetings with him were very good.
Okay.
I called him up. We met. We had several phone conversations. He was entertaining the idea seriously, and then, like that, he changed and no longer wanted to do a transaction of any kind. Maybe he thought that he still wanted to take it private sometime later, but he certainly didn't want to do the deal with me. And he called me up one day and said, "Look, I really don't want to do that deal, and let's just stop talking." And then was unavailable for any further phone conversations or meetings.
Any idea where that came from?
No, but no place good,
Okay. Okay. I know that you had an earlier conversation with him. There was also apparently some meeting later on after the offers had been on the table for a while. Some settlement discussions. I don't know if
Yes.
was he part of that or not?
He was part of that. It was arranged by Judge Rifkin, who was on both of our boards, and Arthur Lyman. And it got nowhere, of course. He said to me very proudly that he hunted lions and tigers, so I was not a threat to him. So I said, well, that just answers the issue. Why don't we just sit down? You're a lion hunter. I'm a little pipsqueak from Philadelphia. Let's see if we can work out a deal. And he said, no, I want no part of that. And he probably lived the biggest life of any CEO in America, maybe even the world. I mean, Their offices were like palaces. He had a 727 of his own. He traveled with his own doctor. He had his plane outfitted to go on safaris with gun racks and all the accoutrements for safaris, and was well paid, on top of it. So he liked the lifestyle, and I guess ultimately thought that I would interfere with that.
Yeah.
Probably right.
Okay. Okay. You also mentioned Judge Rifkin, and I wanted to ask a question about him. It's pretty unusual in my experience to have someone on the board of the bidder and on the board of the target.
Right.
And at least in an unsolicited deal. So what was your relationship to him? What role did he play in this case? I noticed he wasn't a defendant.
Yeah, my relationship with him was very close. He was counsel to my then wife's grandfather and father. I had known him for many, many years. He was an elegant, brilliant, honorable man. I asked him to go on our board, and he agreed, and was a great director. He had a lot of wisdom. He had a lot of smarts. He had a lot of practical experience. He was a district court judge previously, and he was a fabulous director. We did not discuss with him the transaction of the hostile bid, but told him about it when we were making the bid. And he said, I'm going to have to resign from one or the other of the companies. I said, I know. And a day or two later, he called me up and he said, look, I've been on the Revlon board for many years, and I was Revson's counsel, and I think I should resign from your board. And I said, fine. And ultimately, after we did the transaction, he came back on our board, which I thought was very gracious of him, but I always retained a very close and warm relationship with him.
Before, during, and after.
Correct.
Yeah.
And with Arthur also.
Right.
Yeah.
Arthur Lyman, yeah. So this next question is one that's probably impossible to answer because it's hindsight, but the Revlon case has become, if you think of one significant Delaware case, that's probably it.
Right.
Did you have when the litigation started, when the hostilities started, did you have any sense that it was going to be developing into something that momentous?
No. I don't think anybody did. The uniqueness to us at the time was the size of a hostile deal, of that deal. It was probably the largest hostile deal done up until that moment. And to us, that was significant. The concept of an outsider, as myself, going into that arena was sort of unique. But the legal aspects of it, we thought were pretty simple, and everybody calls a hostile deal. It's only hostile to one guy, that's CEO. I mean, ultimately it's the shareholders who decide, and if they want it, it's a friendly deal, so it's either no deal or a friendly deal. It's certainly never a hostile deal to the shareholders, but that's sort of stuck as a title for these kind of deals.
Right. Ultimately you're dealing with the stockholders, but in 1985, when this was all going down, the Delaware Supreme Court had just approved this very weird corporate technique called the poison pill,
right,
colloquially,
right.
And Revlon's directors adopted one. And I'm curious if you recall what your thinking was about that at the time. Was this an obstacle, not an obstacle, something you thought? I know your side challenged it, but what was your thinking about it?
When it first came in play, it was new. We couldn't figure out, what it meant, whether it was legal. But ultimately, Joe and I, Joe Flom and I just, concluded that if we eventually get to a price that is acceptable, it'll disappear. So it's no different than any other transaction at that point. It just brings you to the table a little bit differently and a little bit weaker maybe, but it brings you to the table.
Right.
And so we didn't view it as an insurmountable obstacle.
Yeah. Well, in this case, of course, once there's a deal with somebody and you say the pill's fine, anybody who's somebody plus something plus X is also
Exactly.
fine. So,
Even better.
yeah, right. In the course of the back and forth of the offers and counter offers, Revlon initially did a self-tender, an exchange offer for notes for stock, and I don't know how much you remember about that, but was that something that gave you any pause or gave you any concern?
Well, it was very interesting because just before they did it, I was at the U.S. Open, and I sat in a box that was 2 boxes behind Bergerac's box, the Revlon box. And he had his box full of his cronies and executives, and he was eating grapes. And he started throwing the grapes at me. And fortunately, I had ducked, and he didn't hit me very often, but I was thinking, what's going on, that he's throwing grapes at me? And then he was taking delight that he was going to be the winner, that he just was going to announce on Monday this exchange offer, and that's the end of me, When I read it, to me, he just bought 30% of the stock or whatever it was instead of me buying it, and we'll just equalize the price out, and that's the end of it, It doesn't mean anything, And the whatever conditions they put into the instrument could be waived or were of no moment. So it didn't slow us down for a second. It actually made it, he financed a third of the transaction for us, Not a third, 25% of the transaction for us. That's all he did.
Right. Of course, the case ends up in Delaware.
Right.
It's not that I've always wondered this, but I just recently got curious about the choice of bringing it in Delaware. I mean, I imagine you could have brought the case in New York or maybe elsewhere, but do you recall any thinking about why Delaware?
No, I think that was Joe's choice. I think he felt most comfortable in this case in Delaware. That'll be understood the most, and but that was Joe's call, not mine.
Yeah. Okay. In the course of the back and forth in this deal, after Forstmann Little entered the picture, you had an affidavit at one point where you talked about your philosophy about bidding against Forstmann Little, and the court described it as an incremental bidding strategy where whatever they could bid, you could bid at least somewhat more. Quarter, right, which is what we saw, in fact, right. I think I know the answer to this, but just to hear it from you, what was the thinking more precisely behind that strategy?
Revlon would not give us any of the information, but of course Forstmann Little had the information. And Forstmann Little was a fiduciary and an agent, not a principal. So I figured, look, if it's good enough for a fiduciary agent to buy this transaction at 46 or 47 or whatever, it's got to be good for me. So they did the due diligence for us, in effect. And, we were able to get enough of a feel for the value of the assets we did not want to be in, plus the comfort that Forstmann Little agreed with us as to the value, that we were able to make that statement. So we had a lot of confidence in ability of Forceman Little to do their due diligence properly.
And your work for you.
And our work for us, that is correct.
And you had NOLs that they didn't, presumably.
Correct.
Yeah. So at some point during the bidding process, after litigation gets underway, a number of people reported on settlement discussions and involving they're trying to buy some of the key assets from Revlon from you if you take over the company. Does that ring a bell at all?
No, the only discussion I recall having was up at the Revlon offices late at night, and they called us around dinner time to have this meeting. I offered Forceman Little the ability to buy NHL for $150 million. And we didn't know what NHL was, really, or how good it was. They sort of obscured their numbers in a group, so in the healthcare group. So we couldn't really ascertain how good it was. And I think Teddy would have done the deal, but Michelle said no. And they left about $3 billion on the table by not accepting that.
Right. And Teddy Forceman.
Teddy Forceman.
Yeah. So at the time, I'll just tell you my own recollection
Yes.
of this. We're in court, in the Court of Chancery, and you're trying to enjoin the Forceman deal with its lockups and cancellation fee and no-shop clause, and it all made sense except that at the time the argument occurred in the Court of Chancery, your bid, I think, was at 56 and a quarter, and Forceman was at 57 and a quarter. And I remember thinking, well, maybe they got some good arguments, but why would a court shoot down a 57 and a quarter deal to allow a 56 and a quarter deal to go forward? So my question I'm leading up to is, at what point did you decide and why to up your bid to the 58 that eventually carried the day?
We thought that two things. That Ed might make the judge a little more comfortable in deciding with us that, in fact, we were a higher bid rather than a lower bid. And I just thought that was the place we had to be. Anything else was sort of silly. And I think it surprised them. And fortunately, the judge liked it. And I think it made it a little more difficult to rule against us. And it worked out.
Yeah, well, for what it's worth, I think that was absolutely right. No question about it. But help me out with this one.
Yes.
Because you were at 56 and a quarter versus Forceman's 57 and a quarter for maybe a week or 10 days or so. And I'm wondering, what
Why'd
happened
we
to that
stay there?
incremental bidding strategy?
Yeah.
I mean, why not just top pretty much right away? Is there?
I don't remember what was going on at the time, but there must have been some goings on that made us sort of sit and wait until the right time. I think the timing of when we jumped was to us very important, so that it might maybe take them by a little surprise, and they wouldn't be prepared for it, and I think that's what did in fact happen.
Yeah. Another question that's probably not answerable, but if you look back on what happened, there's a bidding war. There are various thumbs on scales, we all know that. But eventually you come out on top at $58 a share. If you had been sitting in the Revlon boardroom, what do you think the board should have done to get to 58?
Uh, the Revlon board was um, a Bergerac board completely, and never really acted as an independent unit. Um, and when Bergerac brought in Forstmann Little, they were sort of Bergerac's bidding partner. Had the board come to us and negotiated in good faith a transaction, we would have avoided the whole nasty process. And we would have either gotten to their price or not gotten to their price very quickly. They never did that. They never gave us the information. The board should have demanded that. A lot of members of the board, particularly Ezra Zilka, took great offense at the concept that he violated his fiduciary duty as held by the court. And I think that tainted his reputation for a long time afterward, as did other members of the board, because they really didn't do what was required of them. And, you know, that's how he won, basically. But they could have had us and one or two or five other people, or no other people, you know, sit down and work against the Lazard evaluation or another bid, and we either hit it or we didn't, you know, and it would have been much more productive for everybody.
Mm-hmm. So it run much more like a real auction.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
How did you feel about the way the Delaware courts behaved?
I thought we won, so I thought they were great.
Probably a simple question, right?
Yeah, exactly. They were perfect.
Okay, okay. You've gone on to do other deals, buying, selling, and of course the Revlon case is, again, probably one of the most important ones for telling lawyers how these things have to happen and what directors are supposed to do. Did you draw any lessons from that in particular, that case, the way it came out?
I think the most important thing to me that the case provided for is an obligation of the board to do what's right, and and they weren't doing what was right with us, and I think I'm sort of proud that we pursued it to the point to get the courts to hold that there's a responsibility for being a director, and the responsibilities to the shareholders, and you've got to live up to that responsibility. And my daughter now is at NYU Law School, one of my daughters, and she's studying that case. And she fortunately is very impressed with the way her father acted in that case.
So she doesn't call you tenacious and impatient?
No.
Okay.
No, but she saw the good side of her father.
This next question is more a matter of curiosity than about the case, but so you succeed in acquiring Revlon. You had a good bit of information about it, but not everything. Were there
Right.
surprises that you encountered when you?
Only positive ones. NHL was much better than we thought, much better NHL. The assets were worth much more than we thought, the ones that we wanted to sell off. The beauty business was much more difficult to manage than I had thought, although I'm still happy we kept it and still own it. But it turned out to be a much better company than I thought it was before we got in there. And with, peripheral assets, like they had a Hotel Particular in France, in Paris, which was their international headquarters, that was designed around Harold Janine's management style, because that's where Bergerac came from, of having these big management meetings where everybody had a microphone in front of their seat and could speak and answer questions and blah, blah, blah. And it was much too elegant for us. And we put it on the market to sell, and we sold it to, I believe, an Arab buyer shortly after we bought the company for about 150 million US. So there were those kind of little blueberries around that were fabulous. And the people were better than I thought also. So it turned out to be a very, very good deal for us.
Okay. I want to move on to two other cases, but
Mm-hmm.
anything else about that Revlon situation you want to share?
Not that I can think of.
Okay.
If something comes up, I'll let you know.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. So the two other cases are a much more recent one, the M&F Worldwide
Right.
going private transaction. And that, too, has come to be a landmark. And from my perspective, the strategy that was adopted there about pre-requiring approval by a real special committee of independent directors and pre-requiring majority of the minority stockholder approval on full disclosure and a promise that we won't do it unless we get those things done. That's, first of all, that has some risks to it, obviously. Like, what if they don't want to do it?
Yeah.
And by the same token, at the time, it wasn't clear what good that would do you, given the way the law was. So I'm curious about your thinking in terms of how you committed to doing that and how that strategy came about.
It was, I think, pretty easy to come to that position. We had a company that had four sort of boring businesses that nobody took a real interest in. Some of them were in decline. We made an offer that we thought was an exceptionally good offer. And I didn't want to be in a position where we would end up with years of litigation over valuation and pricing. And this was a way that I think Allingham had suggested we could do it and avoid all that. I don't believe it had ever been done before.
That's right.
And I thought it would be, sort of interesting to try something new, and with the belief that I thought we had the right price, and not trying to lowball the transaction. And unfortunately, it worked out. And Leo Strine was the chancellor.
Right.
And I had no idea that he would like it so much, but he loved the approach, and it worked. And I think it's a good way to do transactions. You can't always do them that way, but we at Revlon now, for example, we own about 90% of the stock, and there's 5% that's held by one guy, so you can't have a majority of the minority. So it doesn't always apply that you can do it. Or you may have hostile shareholders that for one reason or another are opposed to it. But if you've got a true uh, shareholder base of size, it's a good way to go, and I'm glad the court liked it.
Yeah. Oh, and I think Tom Allingham's a great lawyer.
Yes.
But I think he had some clues, perhaps, that maybe this was going to work from other things that Chancellor Strine had written. But you never know.
You never know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the worries in structuring a deal that way is that you're going to find some minority shareholders who are going to try to extract holdup out of the situation. But you obviously felt that was not something that was likely given
Yeah,
what you were
yeah,
offering.
I felt comfortable that that would not be the case.
Yeah.
Well, you never can tell, but I didn't think we had, at that moment, anybody that would do that. And, you know, we ended up paying almost a 60% premium over the closing day's price before we announced. So
Pretty attractive.
the price was right.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. All right, my last area of questioning is about the Technicolor case.
Right.
The third in your hat trick of major Delaware cases.
The longest case in
And
Delaware.
absolutely the longest running. So in the Technicolor litigation, which went on for so long, there are lots of back and forth, lots of issues here and there, and I'd like to think that you didn't have to involve yourself daily with each of them. But and we've talked to a lot of the other participants in the case and have their take on it. But as probably the key client, are there things about that case that you'd like to record for posterity?
Yeah, I think two things. I think the concept of looking backwards rather than forwards, as we found ourselves in valuing the price that we were going to pay. The video processing unit became a very, very profitable part of the business, which nobody had any clue of. A lot of the focus was on how that business developed years later, you know. And I think that's the wrong way to look at a transaction. You know, you got to look at it from the moment that you're making the decision to buy and what it looks like, and with the knowledge that's available, and nobody had any idea what home entertainment was going to be. The other thing that was most bothersome was we kept winning the cases, the lower court cases, and then it was sent back by the Supreme Court to be reviewed again, and ultimately the value that was determined to be the right price was less than we paid. But in Delaware, they had the ability to get interest from the moment that the offer became live until they got paid.
At a very attractive rate.
Very attractive rate.
Yeah.
So it became an investment vehicle, the court, rather than a determinant of fact or law or value. And I think that it is and was very unfair. So we ended up paying, 25, I'm making this up, 25 cents less than the offer price, but we paid $50 million in interest, which was just silly. And, the plaintiffs knew that, and this started out, the plaintiffs started out as just wanting to roll from one year to the next, and said, would it be okay if we took our money and, so they started this action to justify that. And then they realized, hey, this is a pretty good investment vehicle, and that's not what the court should be. And so I was a little disappointed in the court, but I think that for the most part, the law that comes out of the Delaware courts is probably the best corporate law in the land.
And in this case, I'll stick up for the courts a little bit because to some extent that was driven by the statute and not by the courts, which also has been maybe not completely fixed, but ameliorated.
Yeah. But I think the judge has some ability to deal with that.
It's true.
I don't think that a plaintiff should, be rewarded in that regard for, in this case, losing,
Right.
with that kind of thing.
Right.
So,
Yeah, or even if winning by a little bit, not worth it. Yeah, I agree. Anything you recall about efforts to settle that case? I mean, over 22 years or whatever it was.
I don't think they ever wanted to settle.
Okay.
Because the amounts were so small that they were the only surviving plaintiff. Everybody else was long gone. The statute had passed, and we would have settled it, $1 more, because there was not much money, and we knew what potentially it could mean with the long drawn out case, which we didn't want. But they saw it as a bank, the U.S. Delaware Savings and Loan,
Or hedge fund or something.
Yes, exactly.
Anything else you'd like to share with students of Delaware corporate law about your involvement in these cases, or other ones that we haven't talked about?
I think as I tell my daughter, who's a student of Delaware law but studying in New York, the courts in Delaware are fair. They're smart. I think they're the smartest business judges in the land. And I think the key to doing well in any court today is to be fair and to be open and be transparent. And I think that's the primary thing that I've learned over time as I've gotten older is transparency and fairness and compliance. Just as a sidelight, and one of the people sitting here listening is going to hate this, but I found myself in a situation on a charitable board recently, and I said, I'll take this job, but these are the 3 things that I'm going to insist upon: diversity, compliance, and transparency. And everybody said, yay, we applaud that, but in reality, when it came down to them and their issue, they didn't applaud it at all, And I ultimately left that enterprise, but I think it makes life much simpler, much easier, And there are no secrets in the world anyway, so be as transparent as you can. And I think the courts like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think most everybody's aware of your extraordinary philanthropy in obvious and visible ways, but fewer people are aware of your gifts to the Delaware corporate law. So I want to thank you for those and everything and for your time.
I thank you
Much
very much. This
appreciated.
is a real treat. I thank you.
Good.
Nice to see you. Thank you.